is the hour, the darkest place. It's a good world, good world going bad.
Now, I grew up on the south side of Chicago, and if you can believe it, on Greenwood Avenue. My mom and I would have ever dreamed that the first African-American president, Barack Obama, would one day make his home just one block away at 5046 South Greenwood. When Mike and I have a shared value around financial literacy, in 1996, just a couple of blocks away on Greenwood Avenue, our company founded a small public school called the Ariel Community Academy. There the kids learn to invest with real money in real stocks and get to meet role models in the financial services industry. And they've honed their research skills using an actual Bloomberg terminal.
Fit well with many white residents in Tulsa. The white mob that attacked Greenwood burned 1,200 homes, looted dozens of shops, left nothing but ruins and rubble across 35 blocks, and massacred more than 200 black residents. But those horrific numbers don't even begin to do justice to the story. I recently read a diary account from someone who was there that night staying at a Greenwood hotel, possibly the hotel owned by John Rogers' ancestors. If you don't mind, I'd like to share a part of that gentleman's diary account. Quote, "About midnight, I arose and went to the north porch on the second floor of my hotel, and I saw the top of Standpipe Hill literally lit up by blazes that came from the throats of machine guns. And I could hear bullets whizzing and cutting the air. 3 men, one of them who lugged a heavy trunk on his shoulders, were all killed as they were crossing the street. Killed before my very eyes. The man who carried the trunk was very old, so the story goes. Likely he had in that trunk many things of great value, and thought as much about the contents as he did about his own life. When the old man was hit by a dozen bullets, he dropped his burden and shrieked and fell sprawling across the hard pavement. Blood gushed from his every wound. I turned my head from the scene," the story goes. End quote. During and after the massacre, there were more than 6,000 arrests of black residents. Not one white person ever went to jail. It was one of the deadliest and ugliest attacks in American history. But like most Americans, I had never heard of it before I came to Tulsa a year ago. And I remember thinking, how is it possible that high schools and colleges don't teach this event? What was it in the history books that I misread or that I skipped over? But as I came to understand it, it wasn't just Greenwood. Let me ask you, how many of us were taught in school about the East St. Louis in 1917, when a white mob killed more than 24 black Americans? Or Elaine, Arkansas in 1919, when a white mob slaughtered 200 black sharecroppers who dared to join a labor union? Or Rosewood, Florida in 1923, when a white mob burned the whole town down? In just that short period, 1917 to 1923, more than 1,000 black Americans were killed by white mobs in cities and towns across the country. But the truth is, what happened during that period was part of a continuum of violence that black Americans faced even after the end of slavery. Violence that denied them their lives, their liberty, and their pursuit of happiness, the cornerstones of the American dream. Just think about the sharecroppers who were cheated out of their fair earnings and sent into debt. They could complain, but not without being thrown off the land. They could report a crime to the all-white police force. They could take the landlord to court with its all-white juries. or petition their elected officials in an all-white legislature. They had nowhere to turn, and black Americans who were cheated by banks that foreclosed unfairly faced exactly the same situation. Even when black Americans managed to use the ballot to win elections and gain power, whites simply took it away, sometimes violently overthrowing the elected government, as white mobs did in places like Louisiana in 1873 and Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898. For black Americans, there was nothing that white landowners, businesses, banks, and politicians might not take. Their wages and their homes, their businesses and their wealth, their votes and their power, and even their lives. What happened here in Tulsa demonstrates, I think, in incredibly stark relief the violent destruction of a prosperous black community and the enormous obstacles that so many black Americans have faced, not only in creating wealth, but in passing assets to their children and grandchildren, as generations of white families have done, thereby creating wealth. Hopefully, such mob-led massacres are in our past. But you don't reverse hundreds of years of theft and exploitation with some modern-day attempt to legislate equal rights, especially when those rights are routinely undermined by racism and inequalities that still exist. Now, I will admit I've never been one to look back. My brain is sort of programmed to look ahead. But I ask myself, could I have built my business and enjoyed my success under these conditions? Of course not. When I was starting out, I knew that my dealings with vendors and suppliers and customers were governed by a set of laws designed to protect me against theft and exploitation. That basic truth, which was critical to my success and to the success of every business in America today, was denied to black Americans for hundreds of years. The 14th Amendment that gave citizenship to black Americans and overturned the Dred Scott decision was a historic milestone for America. But it was also a dead letter for many of the very people it was meant to protect and empower. That's just a fact. And I've always believed in facing facts and following data. If there's one data point that begins to capture the enormity of the legacy that has been handed down to black Americans, I think it is this. Today, the typical black family in America owns 1/10 the wealth of the typical white family. 1/10. That really is a disgrace. But when you think about it from an economic perspective, the exploitation worked exactly as it was designed to do. Slavery, sharecropping, Jim Crow, segregation, and redlining. For hundreds of years, Americans systematically stole black lives, black freedom, and black labor. A theft of labor and a transfer of wealth enshrined in law and enforced by violence. And the impact of that theft over a period of centuries has meant an enormous loss of wealth for individuals and families across generations. A kind of compound interest in reverse. Well, it's time to say enough and to do something about it. The damn well student. Back to Tulsa, because the challenge of African American wealth creation today is inextricably linked to the racial inequalities of the past, and I'm determined to make breaking that link a centerpiece of my presidency. As someone who has been very lucky in life, I often say my story would only have been possible in America, and I think that's true. But I also know that my story would have turned out very differently if I had been black, and that more black Americans of my generation would have ended up with far more wealth had they been white. Instead, they've had to struggle to overcome great odds because their families started out further behind and were excluded from opportunities in housing and employment, education, and others. This weekend, we celebrate the life of Dr. King, and we have to remember that he not only marched for equal rights, he marched for economic justice, because they go hand in hand. He knew that equality under the law was only the first step to true equality. And true equality is only achieved when there is no correlation between race and riches. Fulfilling Dr. King's vision of economic equality across all colors is a monumental challenge. But I'm not running as president to do small things, but to do big things that will make a difference. That was the